I know the authority was formed in '93, and I didn't know. I think weren't you the first executive director?
I was.
You
Uh, and
can
I
you
don't,
tell me a little bit about how you came on board and maybe what was before you and what prompted them to bring you on board?
Curiously enough, Patrick, I just had moved out to the Coachella Valley about a year, maybe a year and a half before I joined the Salton Sea Authority as their first executive director. And I was actually working at a place called CVAG. CVAG was involved in setting up the Salton Sea Authority board meetings. As you know, or as you pointed out, there wasn't a staff to the Salton Sea Authority. And so there was a technical advisory committee made up of staff of each of the four agencies at the time. The Torres Martinez were not a part of the authority to begin with. And they would kind of rotate some of the agenda preparation duties. And CVAG was hired to basically take minutes and address Brown Act related issues and kind of manage the meetings or administer the meetings. So I had a staff person that worked for me doing just that when I was hired at CVAG. And CVAG had been interested, the Salton Sea Authority Board was interested in working with the Bureau of Reclamation on identifying or prioritizing key objectives related to the Salton Sea. They had asked me and CVAG to kind of manage this effort for them. And what the effort was designed to be a 2-day charrette with 8 board members, and in order to coalesce around the priorities of the Salton Sea. And they had identified 21 different priorities, maintaining the sea as an agricultural repository, to economic development, to protecting birds, to creating a fishery, tourism, et cetera, et cetera. And so we ran a little exercise with the 8 board members, and they set this time aside because they were somewhat assured. I can't remember who the board president was at the time, but they were they were sure that the 8 board members actually didn't agree. And it's going to take 2 days to figure out, is the most important thing out there to maintain the sea's elevation or fix bird disease. And we went through this exercise in 2.5 hours, and they realized that they were frankly all on the same page. And they walked away from that board meeting realizing that they did all believe generally in the same thing, and that addressing water quality, it certainly was important, but you also needed to protect the Salton Sea for one of its purposes, and that's as an agricultural repository. If you didn't have it as an agricultural repository, you wouldn't have a Salton Sea. And if you didn't have a Salton Sea, you couldn't address how to improve it to function as a part of the Pacific Flyway.
But one thing, Tom, that I think is very interesting about what you just said, the one thing I didn't hear you say is health, human health, and that wasn't mentioned, nor do I think it was particularly focused on in the early years, because I don't think they realized how grave a concern it was. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, you're right. It wasn't one of the top 21 things that the authority was concerned about at the time, and frankly, it wasn't on my radar either. There was at the time those around the Salton Sea, and certainly our elected officials representing those around the Salton Sea, weren't concerned about the sea drying up. They were concerned about flood damage from the sea going too far up. And I came on board shortly after the Imperial Irrigation District, and spent a lot of money putting dikes around the southern end of the Salton Sea to protect geothermal plants and farmland and everything else. And both water districts had invested a fair amount in acquiring land. So it was definitely a very different world now, close to 30 years ago.
When you were there, what did you find your biggest challenge that you had to deal with?
biggest challenges, kind of, you could group them in a few different ways. One is, you know, what's the challenge on the ground? And the challenge on the ground, which might seem like a long time ago, were thousands, tens of thousands of birds dying. And, you know, addressing kind of the short-term bird disease issues was the challenge of the day. As the QSA moved closer to completion, of course, addressing the politics and potential impacts of the QSA. And at the time, you know, the QSA, not, you know, initially, not all the parties within our two water districts were on the same page, CBWD and IID initially, and then became, you know, partners on the QSA. And then understanding, you know, how that impacted the Salton Sea, depending on what was implemented, was, you know, a really daunting challenge at the time. And, you know, all those projects that we were considering, you know, I'll call it in 2000, couldn't be supported under a reduced inflow scenario. So, you know, sure, you know, building some dikes in the Salton Sea for the engineers out there was really the most cost-effective solution for, you know, the first, you know, for the last, I guess I should say, for 20 or 30 years. And that went up in smoke or died below the water line as soon as the QSA was signed. You couldn't just build a cheap dike and have saline water on one side and hypersaline water on the other side, like you might do in San Francisco Bay Area or other places with, you know, salt ponds. The Salton Sea is a remarkable backdrop for communities. It's a beautiful place. And tell you, Patrick, my biggest challenge, one of my biggest challenges when I was in your seat is, you know, our friends in Washington, D.C. are representing someplace far away, or with a federal agency, or for that matter, with EPA based out of San Francisco. They come down to the Salton Sea for the first time. And if they got here this time of year, or in February or March, and it was a typical glorious day in the Imperial and Coachella Valley, and we drive around the Salton Sea, and they'd say, "What is the problem? This is gorgeous." And it is a gorgeous place. And look at that backdrop behind you and one behind me. It's a beautiful location. It's a beautiful look, and it's not a bad place. Water quality, you know, the water, the mountains. It certainly would be a place for more people in the future, as we're, you know, as increasingly, you know, California realizes it has some housing challenges around the Salton Sea. May be a very good place to put new communities.